Good afternoon to you. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com, here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for the 26th day of January 2016. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am back from New Jersey, where it was a wild weekend. The storm exceeded my expectations, and a lot of science was accomplished, and reporting and live video, incredible time-lapse. If you haven't seen that on YouTube, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. It's also in our app, Hurricane Impact. And I'm going to talk about the trip and the mission up there in a separate video post later this week, I think, or early next week, including some pictures of what the deployment of the cameras looked like and some video and some analysis. So back in the office, and let's talk tropics a little bit. The Atlantic hurricane season, several months away still. But we like to look at some of the larger climate puzzle pieces that might shape how things end up. One of those, of course, would be the sea surface temperature anomalies globally. And you can see here in the Pacific, we still have this El Nino, although it is absolutely steadily starting to just kind of fade out like a slowly dying fire. You don't see these bright reds through here any longer, and it's starting to fade away as we thought it would. Meanwhile, the tropical Atlantic beginning to really warm here, several hundred miles to the southwest of Africa. Water temperatures are above normal, and of course the western Atlantic basin continues its pattern of much above normal as of late. Now, the Gulf of Mexico, this is pretty remarkable. We're almost to February, and we still have the 26-degree isotherm, or about 79.5 degrees Fahrenheit, in the southeast Gulf of Mexico. It's going to take a lot of cold air advection and some fronts coming down in this area to push that colder water out, mix it, and make it dissipate and to normal levels. Once we get into mid-February and beyond, the sun angle starts to become a factor again, and we really start to gradually warm things up climatologically. So we're kind of running out of time for the Gulf to cool off substantially, at least down in the southern part here. It doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot for the upcoming hurricane season. The Gulf of Mexico in here is always going to be warm enough for hurricane development. There's no question about it. But it's this warm water sitting in here with the El Nino pattern still going on, that if we have these big fronts come across and these storm systems, we can have severe lines like we had in recent days here, in the last 10 days, with tornado potential in the peninsula, like we saw in southwest Florida, and then even inland areas in February. Some of the worst tornado conditions in Florida have happened in El Nino years outside of hurricane landfalls. So something to keep an eye on. Now, the El Nino itself, this is interesting. The subsurface map has just kind of all of a sudden grown a bunch of heat in here. I'm going to refresh this so that you can see that. Not sure where it came from. We were tracking this over the last several months, and you see how, if we start off at the beginning here, this heat blob kind of goes away. The cold water in the subsurface was expanding, and then all of a sudden, this comes back. I am at a loss. I don't know where that came from. Usually, you have a westerly wind burst and downwelling of warm water from the western Pacific that makes its way over to the east, and that's where all this came from last year. So I don't know. There was a recent westerly wind burst in the last several weeks, so maybe there was some downwelling in this part of the Pacific, and that's enabled these anomalies to make a little bit of a comeback. But you see that the cold water is still gathering in the western Pacific, and it's just a matter of time that this will continue to fade. And we're still in the height of the El Nino, and the models, as you can see here, indicate that that will be the case maybe even through April, as the latest International Research Institute Climate Prediction Center forecast has come out just a few days ago. And so this is expected over the next several months. Then it goes off a cliff. But notice right in here, the probability of La Nina, that's the blue, has poked above 50% now when we get to the August, September, October time frame. And that's important because if we have La Nina conditions, that typically fosters Atlantic hurricane development. slightly more so than even neutral conditions, and therefore it looks like we may be entering back into a possible busy pattern in the Atlantic, especially considering that the tropical Atlantic is warming up. And you can see a different representation of the models and the overall, just looking at the dynamical average here, this yellow line, once we get to that period there, August, September, October, there it is right there at just a little bit lower than a 0.5 degree Celsius below normal. So most of the models, as you can clearly see here, let me get rid of that and just draw it in this way. You can just clearly see there's only a few of them that keep it above what we call warm neutral. And so, yeah, I think once we get to April and we see the first forecasts coming out from Colorado State University, we're going to see a return to a busy pattern in the Atlantic forecasted. One thing I did want to show you, this map that was produced, I saw it on Twitter, and it shows the different storm surge comparisons in New Jersey between Sandy and the most recent winter storm. And I had cameras along the coast in this region, down here along Seaside Heights, and then another one right up here, I guess it is, in the Brigantine area. And I wish I had some further south, but only one guy and there's only so much I can do. And you see what the different heights are down here. I can scroll down a little bit. The surge was higher overall in this storm than it was in Sandy. And people say, well, my goodness, how could that be? Sandy was so big and powerful and it got, $80 billion in damage or whatever it was. Well, the center of Sandy, even though it was transitioning extratropical in nature, post-tropical, whatever you want to call it, the center of Sandy made landfall not far from Atlantic City in this region. And so everywhere to the north in that right front quadrant had that onshore flow. And so the worst of the Sandy damage was up in this region and then into the New York Bight area off the screen. The storm that just took place moved up and along the coast in such a way that the winds were strongest down in this region and not as strong up here. The waves were not as high along this area. They were higher down here. And so we had surge heights that were, in some cases, we look in here at the, where did I see that? Stone Harbor, more than a foot higher than Sandy right here. And that's important because we can look at this and kind of understand a future hurricane event that if we were to have something making landfall across Delaware, for example, on a trajectory very similar to Sandy, but farther to the south, then this part of the coastline could be absolutely devastated. So using what we saw in this storm and Sandy can help us understand threats in the future. And I'll talk more at length about that in a presentation here on a video discussion later on. Lower 48 weather, boy, what a few days difference it makes here to look and see the map almost blank. Just a little wintry weather here in western Texas and southern to southeast New Mexico. The GFS model over the next 5 days doesn't really show too much in the way of severe weather, winter storm wise or otherwise. Pretty cold out west with the storm system moving into the Pacific Northwest, but nothing that you can't handle if you've made it this far, so to speak. Excellent rains for extreme northern California and parts of the Olympic Mountains there, Washington State, Oregon, etc. And really no major problems for the East Coast. That winter storm that people were talking could affect the East Coast this weekend, making it 2 in a row, probably not going to happen. So, for the most part, a kind of benign pattern over the next several days. Warming up in the east, it's 70 degrees here at my office in Wilmington, North Carolina. That's awesome. And the snow will be melting rapidly up and down the East Coast, which could cause some flooding. So be wary of that. And other than that, it's a pretty quiet pattern for now. February, there's some rumblings that it could be busy again in February, but we'll wait until February to deal with that. All right, well, thanks for tuning in again. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. Always a pleasure to bring you this information, and I appreciate all the support and the feedback and the interactions during the mission. And as I said, I will talk about that in more detail in a few days. Until then, have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll talk to you again soon.